I need you calm, Peter. And I need you alive, Jack. Private needs you alive. Hundreds of people all counting on you. You can't do this alone. Morgan knew that was the truth, but he pushed it from his mind. One person who had counted on him was dead. Watch Flex's office, Peter, and track this phone if you need to, but don't interfere, he ordered, as he heard footsteps coming towards him. Hooligans already tried, but the system must be throwing false echoes. It says that you're in the Tower of London. Morgan almost smiled. Then the system is working perfectly. Goodbye, Peter. I'll contact you soon. He ended the call and turned to face the source of the footsteps. Your Highness? He greeted Princess Caroline, surprised to see her alone. Don't worry about me, she told him, sensing his unease. This is the safest place on earth for me. The Beefeaters are as loyal as anyone can be. So Colonel de Villiers told me. What can I help you with, Your Highness? Just take a short walk with me. I've run out of grants to sign, and I think some air would do me good. Morgan looked towards the door of the building that housed the cellar. There was no sign of de Villiers, and the answers he would bring, so Morgan agreed, falling into step alongside Princess Caroline as she paced the courtyard between the Beefeaters' tightly packed homes. There are 35 families here, she told the American beside her. Some have children, and they live in the bigger houses. Then there are the smaller apartments for the single ones. There's more and more of them, I'm afraid to say. Service in the military seems to take a terrible toll on families. It does, Morgan agreed, his eye following a large black raven that hopped across the open courtyard, pecking between paving stones. Legend says that if the ravens leave the tower, then the kingdom will fall. Morgan sensed that the royal was making small talk to delay divulging what was really on her mind. You can say what you need to say. It's just us here, Your Highness. Okay then, Jack. I've lost someone whom I loved. Thanks to you, the person responsible for taking her from me is now in custody. He will receive justice, and he will do so through the British legal system. The implication of the words was clear for Morgan, and he held the woman's gaze. Of course. Do you know who brought law and order to this country, Jack? It was the monarchy. It was the crown. Sophie? Jane? This all started with me, Jack, and I want to end it before violence is brought to our streets. I am hurting, Jack. You know how much I am hurting, and the only thing that can hurt me more is to see more blood spilled. Morgan took a deep breath. He respected Caroline, and his words came out evenly and under control. I will not stop looking for Flex. I'm not asking you to stop looking. It's what you plan to do when you find him that's scaring me. Please promise me that when you do find him, you'll let the police take it from there. Promise me that you'll let the British legal system do its job. Morgan could see genuine concern in the woman's earnest eyes. Concern for his own safety, but also for a greater cause, that of law and order in the country she was sworn to serve. Does your country have the death penalty? Morgan asked. It doesn't. Then I won't make a promise I can't keep. I want justice, and that isn't it. Then we may find ourselves at odds, Jack. Maybe we will, and I'm sorry if we do. So am I. She smiled sadly. Good night, Jack. Whatever happens, thank you for finding Sophie. Morgan tried to smile in return. Then Princess Caroline turned and walked away. Chapter 91. Morgan stood alone in the centre of the courtyard for some time after his conversation with the princess. Except for the occasional tramp of a sentry's feet or the caw of a raven, the place was quiet. The tower's walls muted London's traffic, giving it the serene sense of being a place of calm amidst the city's storm. Of course, for Morgan, that was exactly what it was. Soon, it would be time to go out into that storm. De Villiers' tall frame appeared in the doorway of one of the buildings. You could have waited inside, the colonel told him. I wanted to think, Morgan replied, and think he had done. Of Jane Cook, of Sharon Lewis, of Jeremy Hooligan Crawford, of Peter Knight, all wards in his care, all people that on some level he had failed. In Cook's case, Morgan's actions and lack of foresight had led to her death. "Whatever you're thinking, it's not good for you." De Villiers frowned, reading Morgan's features like a map. "You need your head on straight, Morgan. Come on, man. This isn't what I expected from you. Look at how you handled the people who took Abby Winchester." "I've lost one of my agents, Colonel." He didn't need to tell de Villiers that he had lost much more than that. "I know you have, Morgan. And now you have this." He passed Morgan a sheet of paper. "What are these?" "Joyce has had no luck in contacting Flex directly, and he's heard nothing from him since He's heard nothing from him since then. What you have here," he continued, "is a list of addresses that Flex has been known to frequent. And these," he pointed, "are the details of Flex's expected accomplice, Nathan Ryder. Joyce heard that Ryder had been brought over from Africa by Flex. Apparently Ryder isn't the kind of man who cares to be in a country where there is a higher kind of law than who has the biggest guns, and so the pieces fit that he's here for one reason." "To kill me. To try?" "I'll walk you to the gate. I expect you'll want to make use of the night." They walked in silence. Morgan left the way he had come in, through the small door set into the wall. As he emerged, he found himself facing lengthways along the Thames, London's skyline brilliant in the darkness. "You have everything you need?" de Villiers asked, emerging beside him. "I do," Morgan replied, his eyes on the towers that were lit up towards the clouded heavens. "Then I'll leave you with one last thought. I'm giving you as much rope as I can, Morgan, you understand. Precise and deliberate retribution I will allow you, but I get it." "Good. Just remember that this is London, not Afghanistan. If you bring war onto our streets, you'll be in our sights as much as he is. This city's suffered a lot these past few years. Our security forces are on a hair trigger." Morgan nodded. "Thank you for your help, Colonel." He put out his hand, and de Villiers took it in a firm grip. "Get the bastard, Morgan. Get him and put him down." Chapter 92. Jack Morgan walked a mile from the tower using back streets, main roads and alleyways. Happy that he was clear of tails, he'd put a call in to Hooligan, passing him the few addresses given up by Corporal Joyce. "Get CCTV in those areas if you can," Morgan had instructed. "Have surveillance teams stood by, but no one is to leave Private HQ unless I order it." Then he had given his London team a second set of instructions. 30 minutes later, an old Ford Focus pulled up at exactly the spot Morgan had requested, the driver getting out and walking away without a backwards glance. Taking a few seconds to check his surroundings one more time, Morgan pulled a carrier bag from where he had shoved it into a hedge, felt the weight of the pistols inside and walked to the car. He entered the driver's side, found the key in the ignition and started it up. A few seconds later, he was on his way to the first of Flex's addresses. Chapter 93. 2 years ago, Michael Flex Gibbon had run his security enterprise from atop a beautiful glass building that sat alongside the Thames. So great were the views, and so heavy his workload, that he had lived in the same building. A lot had changed since Jack Morgan had beaten the SAS soldier down, blowing out the man's knee and sending the rumour mill wild. Flex was a soft ass. Flex couldn't cut it any more. Why were the heads of 2 security firms fighting in the first place? I'll take my business elsewhere. Now Flex's operation was run out of a town centre office in Tottenham, sandwiched between a chartered accountant's and a failed business whose windows were covered with wood panels and graffiti. It was a big fall, for a big ego. Peter Knight sat lonely in his car, looking at the bricks and mortar, reasoning that had driven Flex to seek out Morgan and cause him pain. "All because of his bloody pride," Knight said sadly, shaking his head. He was in a small car park, 100 yards from the buildings that showed no signs of life. Even if Flex still ran operations around the globe, Knight guessed that the smaller-scale business would now employ a duty manager that worked from home, or wherever his laptop and phone happened to be. It was that way for many of the smaller security companies, of which Flex's business had undoubtedly become one. Knight looked down to his lap, where he held a dossier on Flex Gibbon. It was possible to read it by the streetlights, and he thumbed through its pages, marvelling at how a solid SAS trooper could go from national hero to murdering monster. It was ego, Knight decided. All ego. That, and pride, had pushed Flex to join the army as a young man, after being beaten his whole childhood by his father. Ego had pushed him further, to volunteer for selection for the SAS. Ego had kept him going over the arduous hill phase of training in the Brecon Beacons. Ego had kept him going in the jungle. Ego had kept him going during escape and evasion, where he had been beaten and waterboarded. Ego had allowed Flex to endure so much. It had allowed him to build a thriving business. But then, when that ego had been damaged, it had exploded. Knight turned the next page. It was a picture of Flex's children, now young adults, one studying at Liverpool University and the other in Manchester. The kids looked bright and athletic. A note in the dossier said that custody of the children had gone to their mother. The grounds of divorce had been that Flex was forever away on service for his country, and that when he returned he'd be angry and violent. On one occasion he had locked his wife in the bathroom for a day to teach her some respect. The police in Herefordshire had dropped the case in deference to Flex's meritorious service. In what then looked like a trade with his wife, Flex had not fought the divorce. Knight looked again at the picture of the man's children. What effect had their father's choice of career had on their lives? Were they able to live like their other classmates at university? Were they able to settle disputes with calm words, or did they fly to anger and violence? Did they feel abandoned or resentful? Were they ambivalent towards their father, or did they hate him? Was he a part of their lives, or was he forever estranged, forgotten? Knight rubbed at his eyes as he realized he was asking these questions as much about himself as about Flex. Though Peter Knight could say honestly that he had never intentionally caused his children any harm, they had been harmed because of him. The death of their mother had been traumatic enough, but Knight's role as head of Private London brought with it a constant threat of danger. He thought of how he'd almost lost them 6 years ago when they were kidnapped as part of Cronus's vicious attack on the London Olympic Games. How could Knight live with himself if his children were brought into this? He couldn't, he knew. And the children were growing older. They were understanding more and more each day. They were reading moods and reacting to them. Danger aside, Knight's workload at Private was enormous. He could not have it any other way, as he was responsible for the lives of other people. But did he want to be just another absent father who put his business life before his children? With his beloved wife gone, did Knight really want to continue risking his own life, and potentially orphan Luke and Isabel? He didn't know the answer. But one thing was clear. Once this mission was done, Knight would have to seriously evaluate his life. He would have to choose between being the father he wanted to be, or Private. Chapter 94. Jack Morgan drove slowly into the suburban estate in the borough of Wandsworth, south of the Thames. Unlike parts of central London, the homes here were detached, sat back behind manicured lawns, and nestled amongst trees that were heavy and lush with summer rain. Morgan smiled as he saw the surroundings, but not out of any sense of romance. It would make his job of getting close to the buildings easier. He would need to move quickly, as there were 3 addresses listed to Flex on the paper. Morgan had chosen the closest to the tower to begin his search, but he was aware that the cover of night was in short supply in summer. Estimating time to travel between each, he had less than an hour for each location. He was 100 yards away from his target now, so he pulled his car to the curbside and got out next to a narrow alley that led between two patches of greenery. Checking Google Earth, Morgan saw that the alley led to a pathway that ran behind the houses, before emerging onto a park and sports field. He turned the bright screen of the phone off, put it into his pocket, and followed the path used by dog walkers and football-mad children during the day. Tonight it would serve a darker purpose, and Morgan took the semi-automatic pistol in his right hand before pushing it into his jacket pocket. If need be, he could fire through the material and off the hip. Counting off his paces, as taught to him in marine training, Morgan measured the distance, the practice accurate enough for him to know that he had come to a stop behind the correct building, a 2-story brick home that showed no light and emitted no sound. The house was separated from the footpath by a thin fence and a few trees, and it was no effort for Morgan to raise himself over the fence and drop quietly into the back garden. There he waited. There was nothing. Deep in suburbia as it was, Morgan did not expect Flex to have the garden defended as if it were Fort Knox. Nothing drew suspicion like a big musclehead with sirens in his garden. But even so, he inched slowly across the open space to the back wall, his hand twisting the pistol's grip so that the barrel was aimed through the material at the back door. Morgan was halfway across the small garden when the sensor light flicked to life. He had expected it, and now covered the remaining distance in a split second, pressing himself against the back wall. He was cloaked from view from the windows, but he would be looming proudly on any CCTV screens that were inside the building. Morgan was willing to take a chance on that, having seen no flicker of lights inside to indicate that anyone was awake. He could only hope that the house wasn't empty. It wasn't. Morgan saw him as he peered through the corner of the window. Nothing but a pair of feet raised up at the end of a sofa. Confident that the man was sleeping and not watching TV, Morgan moved to the door and considered the lock. It was garden variety, the same as almost any suburban home. He reached into his left pocket and pulled out one of the items he had instructed to be placed in the old Ford's glove box. It was a lock-picking kit, and Morgan made short work of the old chub. Then, pressing delicately, he depressed the handle and pushed open the door. The house alarm sounded shrill and violent in the calm night. Morgan had been prepared for it, and as the first note pierced his eardrums, he ditched his plan A of quiet calm and resorted to plan B, keeping in mind the 3 principles of close-quarter battle. Surprise. Morgan had taken the sleeping man unaware, and he had a few seconds to act before the man regained full function of mind and body. Speed. Morgan raced across the threshold and into the living room like a charging bull, pulling the pistol free of his jacket. Violence of action. Before the man could even raise himself off the sofa, Morgan had gripped him by the throat and pressed the cold steel of the pistol's muzzle into the man's ear. "Alarm," Morgan hissed. "Turn it off. Now." Gripping the man by his trachea, he lifted him to his feet. The man saw that his situation was hopeless, and he used his wide, white eyes to guide Morgan to the alarm box. Jabbing his finger awkwardly at the digits. Within 10 seconds of the door opening, all had returned to silence, but for the man's gasped breaths. Morgan shoved him to the floor and trained the pistol onto the back of his head. Only then did he notice the man's left arm and shoulder were bandaged. "You got shot in the forest," he guessed. The man said nothing, but when Morgan delivered a blow onto the recent gunshot wound, he groaned like an animal. "I'll open up another one in the back of your head if you don't start talking," Morgan promised. "You know who I am. And you know I'm working outside the law, so talk. Are you Ryder?" "I'm not," the man spat through clenched teeth. "Then who the hell are you?" Morgan demanded, pressing the gun into the back of the man's skull. "Herbert. Chris Herbert." "You work for Flex?" "I work for myself." A finger into the recently sutured gunshot wound convinced the man to change his answer. "Yes. Flex. Yes." "You're a mercenary. Well, I have a proposition for you. You help me get Flex, and I pay you back by not blowing your brains out over the carpet." "Dram it, you yank tart." Morgan pressed his thumb into torn flesh and broken bone. Then he let Herbert tell him everything. Chapter 95. The thought of his children and the implications of a life without them weighed heavily on Peter Knight as he watched the row of offices in Tottenham. He rubbed at his eyes, certain that the long hours and excitement had got to him, but he was not wrong in what he was seeing. Flex. There was no mistaking the size and shape of the muscle-bound man as he slinked quickly inside of his building. Fingers almost fumbling, Knight tried Morgan's phone. It went straight to voicemail. "Damn it, Jack," he cursed. He then tried Hooligan's number, and it connected. "Jez? Flex has shown up at his office. Keep trying Jack from your end. I'm going to call Elaine and see if she can move some units closer, without us having to spill all the beans on why." "All right, but stay safe. Don't do anything stupid, Peter." "I'll watch from the car," Knight promised, hanging up. A moment after he did so, he heard a metallic object tapping on the glass of his driver's window. In that split second, Peter Knight knew the game was over, and he was the loser. Chapter 96. Herbert had spilled some good information as to who Flex was working with. There was also the chance he was lying, but Herbert swore blind that the former Foreign Legion man, Nathan Ryder, was the only other man Flex trusted to stand by him during outright murder. Ryder had been waiting in London during the shootings in Wales, should opportunity arise there. Once Herbert had gone down to Lewis's gunshots, treated by Flex, a deft medic from long experience, Ryder and Flex had ridden together, and Herbert's part in the actions had been reduced to watching the news channels and reporting to Flex anything of interest. "He thinks it was you that caused the Knightsbridge shooting," Herbert told him. "Thinks you went in there, looking to get yourself a piece." "And what do you think?" Morgan asked, pressing the steel of the stolen pistol against the man's head. "You know you shot someone. You're in as much shit as me." The only shots Morgan had fired were to take down the lighting fixtures. It must have been the girl's wild shots that had found Flesh and left the dark blood trail on the dance floor. "Who was it?" "Some bell-end TV presenter. It clipped off a few fingers, apparently." Morgan didn't feel too bad about that. He was relieved that it wasn't Natalie or the security men who'd been hit. "Look, mate," Herbert tried, "I've been in enough bad situations to recognize a really bad one, and the only way I see of getting out of this is by working with you." No honor amongst thieves, Morgan thought to himself. Same goes for scumbags. "Talk. I'll testify. I'll tell them everything they need to know about Flex. I just need looking after, because he'll kill me if we end up in the same prison." But Morgan shook his head. "I don't need testimony. I need him brought out in the open. I need him in front of me so I can deal with him myself. But, look, you've seen this guy's capacity for revenge. You think being in a different prison is what's going to save you from him? No. If you're going to live past tonight, you need to help me. And if you're going to live after that, then you need Flex in the dirt." "Shit," Herbert hissed, knowing that it was the truth. "Shit. What is it you need me to do?" Morgan bundled Herbert into the back of the Focus. Already wounded, and with his wrists bound in tape, there was little Herbert could do to escape. A final piece of tape across his mouth had been enough to stifle the groans of pain. Morgan had not been gentle on the man. The American scowled as he looked at the captive on the back seat behind him. In truth, he still had no concrete plan of how he would use Herbert to get to Flex. Though it pained him to do so, Morgan knew he must take his foot off the gas and allow thought to take over from action. He realized that the best place for him to do that would be in private London's headquarters, where he could draw on the minds of his agents. As if his thoughts were being read, he saw a familiar name flash up on his phone's caller ID. He took it on the second ring. His eyes, in the car's mirrors, as he pulled out of the Wandsworth estate and headed towards London city centre. "Peter, I'm coming back to HQ. I'll meet you there in 10. "No," Flex's voice answered him. "You won't." Chapter 97. "Don't do it," a strange voice had said from outside of Peter Knight's car, seeing his finger moving to redial. "I'll put one in your head before your call goes through." Slowly Knight had turned his head. He had not been surprised by what he'd seen, and had found himself looking into the barrel of a pistol. It was held by an ugly man in a dark hoodie. "You fucking amateur," the man had sneered. "Maybe you want to turn down the brightness of your phone next time you call in a sighting. Get out of the car." Knight obliged, furious with himself. The man was right. Knight had acted like an amateur. Thoughts of his children had clouded his mind, and on seeing Flex, he had acted quickly without thinking. Now that impulse would probably mean he would never see Luke or Isabel again. "Flex is the only one who's killed someone. You can get out of this if you turn him in." The ugly man had half smiled, as if he'd felt sorry for the private agent in front of him. "You really should have stayed in the amateur leagues." Knight had heard a sound behind him. Then had come darkness. He regained consciousness in the back of a van, his head covered. He had no concept of where he was, or for how long he'd been unconscious. All he knew for certain was that he'd been abducted, and that he was in serious trouble. The van stopped, and he felt the suspension move as a significant weight departed, opened the door and climbed into the rear. A second later, what must have been a meaty hand swiped Knight's hooded head, sending it bouncing off the wooden floorboard. "Are you awake?" Flex asked. Knight said nothing. Flex hit him again. Already bruised from the hit he had taken in Mayor Patel's home, Knight gritted his teeth against the pain. "I said, are you awake?" "I'm awake," Knight replied, tasting blood on his teeth. The Hessian sacking of his hood smelled rank and musty as it pressed against his face. "Morgan's on the phone," Flex told him. "Say hello." "Morgan?" Knight asked, raising his voice so that it would carry. Flex finished the conversation for him, savagely punching Knight so that the man's groans carried all the message needed. Then Flex stepped from the van's rear doors and shut Knight alone in the confines of his misery. Chapter 98. "Still there, Jack?" Flex said, climbing back into the passenger seat and motioning for Ryder to drive. "I'm here," Morgan growled down the phone. "Now what is it you want, Flex?" "You haven't killed him. There must be a reason. How much do you want?" "This isn't about money, Jack. You should know that by now." "I'll give you $20 million. Flex laughed, but beside him Ryder frowned, tuning into the conversation. Flex tried to silence the man's piqued interest with a hard look, but it didn't work. "This isn't about money," Flex said again, as much for Ryder's benefit as for Morgan's. "The reason he's still alive is that I want to kill him slowly. And I want you to know all about it, Jack. I want you to see it. I want you to hear it. I want you to feel it. I don't like my chances of getting you alive, but he's close enough for what I've got planned. You I can deal with later." "Why wait?" Morgan asked. "Deliver Knight unhurt, and you can have me. You can have your fun with me." "I wasn't born yesterday, you dickhead." There was a moment of silence on the line. Flex felt Ryder's scowl, the man clearly unhappy that £20 million had been so quickly dismissed. "Talk to him about the money," the ugly man urged, only shutting up when Flex strained against his seat belt like an angry pit bull. "Well, if we've got nothing more to talk about, Jack." "How do you like loose ends, Flex? Because I've got one of yours in the car with me, and he's about to get dropped at private HQ. "Bollocks," Flex snorted. "His name's Chris Herbert," Morgan announced, giving away the details of how and where he had taken the man. Flex's face grew more angry with each piece of information. "He's ready to roll on you. You may kill Knight, you may kill me, but this is solid evidence against you, Flex. You'll be on the run for the rest of your life. It took every measure of Flex's self-control not to dash the phone to pieces. He had never expected to stay in the UK after enacting his revenge, but there was a big difference between being a suspect who quietly slipped off the radar, leaving only theories and no evidence, and being a suspect with one of the culprits testifying to his guilt. "Fuck!" he finally shouted, losing the battle with his rage and the synthetic testosterone that coursed through his body. "I'll give you your man back once you put a bullet in that useless bastard's brain." "Do your own dirty work," Morgan replied, the sounds of a panic-stricken Herbert coming from behind him as he strained against the tape on his mouth. "Herbert for Knight." "Done," Flex spat. "Be in central London. The meet will be at 05:30. He didn't need to tell Morgan that he'd hold back the location of that meeting place until the last minute. "Make it public," Morgan told him. "I'll be waiting." Chapter 99. Jack Morgan spent the wait in an industrial area of Battersea, placing him close to central London's many bridges. The Ford Focus pulled to the curb alongside steel fencing and litter. "Flex wants me to put a bullet in your head and dump you." Morgan eyed the trash on the roadside. Herbert tried to speak through the tape. His eyes had calmed, and they pleaded with Morgan to let him talk. "Don't speak," Morgan told him. "Just listen." The man ceased his movement and stifled words. "You realize there's a chance Flex just puts a bullet in us both the moment we arrive?" Herbert nodded. "I have an idea, but you have to play your part." The man raised his eyebrows. "You'll find out when we get there. Just do as I say. Flex is who I want. Understand?" The man nodded. He understood. Just as Morgan had felt no great personal animosity towards Joyce for helping to conspire to kill him, neither did he feel it towards Herbert. Jack Morgan lived in a world where people tried to kill him on a regular basis. It was an occupational hazard. It was when they involved the people he cared about that he began to see things personally. Herbert had not been there when Flex had pulled the trigger and killed Jane Cook. If he had, he'd be dead already. The man couldn't know it, but being shot by Lewis had likely saved his life. Morgan sighed and looked along the empty street that was bathed beneath orange streetlights. He thought about Peter Knight, how his friend was a captive of a man who had shown himself to be a murderer. How the father might soon make orphans of his children. How a professional investigative agent had allowed himself to be caught so easily by the people he was there to track. With guilt, Morgan realized that he was angry with Knight. He tried to push the feeling away, but the sense that Knight had come between Morgan and justice for Cook would not shift. Hadn't Morgan told him to send other agents to watch Flex's office? Hadn't he trained Knight, taught him, and trusted him? Now, when he needed him most, and when he was finally getting ahead through the capture of Herbert, Knight had flipped the field back in Flex's favour. He was putting them all in Flex's hands, and giving the man a chance to play his endgame. Morgan had only a wild card left to play, and if that failed, he was at best back to the beginning in his search for Flex. At worst, he was on his back with a bullet in his head. The next hour passed in waves for Morgan. 1 minute there was anger at Knight, the next guilt that he could ever think that way. Then came sadness. Then came grief. Then came rage that Flex was at large. That rage led to the obstacle that now stood in the way of justice, Knight, and so began the cycle once more. To break it, Morgan attempted to distract himself through meticulous checking of his 2 pistols. He broke them down one at a time, one always with a bullet in the chamber and close at hand, should he need to use it, and inspected and cleaned every part of them to ensure there would be no malfunction when he needed them most. Morgan's ammunition count stood at 8 9mm rounds for the semi-automatic pistol and 6.357 rounds for the revolver. Not enough for a protracted gunfight, but maybe enough to put Flex and Ryder down if he drew first. And was he willing to do that? Rubbing the heel of his hand into tired, blood-red eyes, Morgan could not be sure. He hated Flex, and wanted the man removed from society and the world. But Jack Morgan had always pictured himself as a defender, a man who took life in order to save others. Could he really draw his pistol first, and shoot Flex and Ryder down in cold blood? For the sake of justice for Jane, he wanted that answer to be yes. But deep down, beneath the anger and the pain, he admitted to himself that he just did not know. Morgan finished assembling and reloading the pistol in his hands, cocked back the hammer, and pointed it at Herbert's startled face. Pull the trigger, he told himself. Pull the trigger. Find another way to get Flex. Find another way to rescue Knight. Knight put himself in this position. Why should Jane's killers go unpunished for his mistake? Pull the trigger. Morgan's anger screamed at him. Pull the trigger. Kill this son of a bitch, and then kill the others. Do it. Kill him now. Morgan lowered the pistol and turned to the front. Behind him, having seen the murderous intent in the American's eyes and believing his life to have run its course, Herbert began to whimper. Before Morgan could tell him to shut up, his phone vibrated. Chapter 100. The first location sent to Morgan was a waypoint. Morgan expected that Flex would hold the final destination until the last moment, but the muscle-bound murderer needn't have worried. Morgan had no intention of alerting anyone who could stand between himself and Flex. His mind was as set as a Marine charging an enemy machine-gun nest, focused on nothing but the result of his actions, his own safety an afterthought unworthy of consideration. Flex's first direction sent Morgan to Brixton, the second to Waterloo. Morgan was then instructed to proceed to Lewisham, until Flex called back with the location of the true meeting place, London Bridge. At first, the sight of the meeting point surprised Morgan. It was public. It had limited access. Perhaps Flex really did intend to honour the swap, or perhaps, like Morgan, he was ready to die to get what he wanted, and the bridge was the best bottleneck to make sure that happened. "We're going to go in on foot," Morgan told Herbert, remembering the barriers that had been put in place to stop terrorists from driving vehicles into pedestrians, and knowing that any stopped car on the structure would draw instant scrutiny from the security services. "You realize your best chance to live is by doing what I say?" he asked the man again. Herbert nodded, and Morgan ripped away the tape that had covered the man's lips. Herbert grimaced as pieces of skin tore away with it. The tape on the man's hands would stay, covered by a coat, the hood pulled up over the man's head and zipped in place to act as an impromptu straitjacket. "I've counted my rounds. You mess this up, I'm holding one back for you." "I won't," Herbert promised. "All that crap that mental bastard told me about unit loyalty and honour, and then he goes and tells you to stick a bullet in me. Give me a gun and I'll shoot him myself." Morgan smiled at the idea. "Out the car!" They left the Focus in a disabled parking bay next to London Bridge Station. Morgan had no intention of coming back to it, and had pushed the revolver into the front of his trousers, the semi-auto in the back. Herbert had said that Flex expected Morgan was behind the Knightsbridge shooting, and so it was safe to assume he knew Morgan would be packing heat as a result. What Morgan couldn't guess was whether or not Flex would ask him to expose those firearms on the bridge and to draw the inevitable attention that would bring. "He won't give you your meat." Herbert shook his head. "He's a nutter, and all he's talked about for months is killing ye." Morgan ignored him, instead taking in his environment. The area was quiet, but slowly breathing its way to life. Early birds in suits made their way towards the station. A street sweeper cleared plastic glasses and cigarette ends from outside a pub. Looming above all this was a 1,000-foot-high sentinel, the Shard, looking like it had been plucked straight from one of Tolkien's fantasy worlds, then clad in glass. Morgan looked at his watch. 5:28. They would hit the bridge's centre at exactly the time of Flex's request. The bridge itself was a flat expanse, the pedestrian pavement on each side as wide as its 2 traffic lanes. Across it came a dribble of cars and lonely pedestrians, people ensconced in their own worlds with no idea that life and death was about to pass them by within meters. "Keep on my left side," Morgan told Herbert, wanting to keep the firing line of his right hand free. "You see any of Flex's people?" It will only be Ryder with him. It was only me and him that Flex brought in. Morgan kept looking over the people ahead of him, nonetheless. He wasn't about to make assumptions based on the word of a man who had tried to kill him. "Where the hell is he?" Morgan growled as they reached the centre of the bridge's long span. There were no stopped vehicles, no sign of Flex's bulky form or Ryder's rangy figure. "Where the hell are they?" "Traffic," Herbert suggested. Morgan shook his head. At this time of the day the roads were almost bare. Too late he saw the trap that had been set. "Shit," hissed Herbert as he saw the same. "We've got to run." But Morgan did nothing. He simply watched as the police car came slowly across the bridge and indicated that it was about to pull up alongside them. Morgan had been set up. Chapter 101. "We need to leg it, now," Herbert urged. "If they catch you with those guns, you're done." Morgan knew it, and yet he remained where he was, his eyes tracking the police car that was gliding along the curbside, now only 10 meters away. "Move, and I'll kill you," he told the man beside him. "What are you going to do? Kill me, then the coppers?" Could he? Morgan asked himself. Could he shoot police officers acting in the line of duty, so that he could bring his own brand of justice to Flex? Could he bring the same heartbreak that he now felt to the families and loved ones of these officers? No, Morgan knew. Not a chance in hell. And so his options were to run or stand. He chose to stand, and Herbert hissed that he was an idiot. Morgan said nothing. Maybe he'd be proved wrong, but he was listening to his gut, and his instinct told him that Flex would not be happy with Morgan simply being arrested and imprisoned. Flex wanted Morgan's blood as badly as Morgan wanted his. No, Morgan told himself, growing more certain. Flex wouldn't send the police, and though Morgan believed in coincidence, he did not believe that a squad car would happen to pull up on him the moment he walked onto London Bridge, and single him out when dozens of other pedestrians were walking across the length of the bridge. There was something more going on here, and as the car drew close enough for the early morning light to illuminate the occupants, Morgan saw that his gut had been right. Flex. There was no mistaking the bulk that sat in the car's passenger side, and who now emerged onto the roadside, clad head to foot in police gear, his equipment accurate down to the shoelaces. Behind him the rear door opened and Ryder stepped forth, equally tailored. So dressed, neither the men nor their car would draw unwanted attention. Security was a part of London life, and nowhere more so than at its iconic locations. Flex had taken the precaution of turning off the car's interior lights so that they did not come on with the open doors, and Morgan could only just make out the shape of the figure in the car's recesses. Behind the wheel sat the face of another police officer, and Morgan chanced a glance to Herbert, who gave a quick shake of his head. He didn't know him. "You keep your mouth shut, you fucking rat," Flex snarled at Herbert. "Did the regiment teach you nothing?" "Taught me that you'll blow the bridge to save yourself," Herbert replied. "Shut up," Morgan told him, as calmly as he could in the presence of Jane's killer. Then to Flex. "Take Knight out of the car, and Herbert's yours." "Change of plan on that one," Flex shrugged his massive shoulders. "Knight can go, but you're coming with me." Morgan held his tongue. He'd expected the gambit, and now ignored it, instead taking in his options and his chances. Flex and Ryder were both armed, pistols holstered on their hips. As seasoned pros, neither man was impinging on what would be the other's aim. Ryder stood aside and staggered from Flex. Morgan was a quick draw, but he couldn't expect to take down both men before he was hit himself. Was he willing to die to kill Flex? Was he willing to give Knight's life too? "Let's talk money," Morgan said. "You said no to 20 million. Let's make it 30. 30 million to walk away," Flex sneered. "To walk away from this bridge," Morgan corrected him. "We both know that this doesn't end until one of us is dead." Flex. "I'll give you 30 million to give me Knight and leave this bridge." Flex scoffed, and Morgan looked to Ryder. You may not want the money, but maybe your men do. They want what I want, Flex growled, taking a pace forwards. Honor. Respect. But the look on Ryder's face told Morgan different. 35 million. Let him speak, Flex, Ryder said from behind his boss. That's a lot of money. He's trying to confuse you, you soft bastard, Flex snarled, turning back to Ryder. I'm trying to save my friend's life, and to get us off this bridge. Morgan now spoke to Ryder directly. 35 million, or a lifetime as a wanted murderer. Your choice. The look on the former Foreign Legion man's face said it was a simple one. Let's get back in the car, Flex. Let's get out of here, and at least talk about this. We're not going anywhere. It's a lot of money. As the two men scowled at one another, Morgan chanced to look at the police car's driver. The man was pale with nerves, his hands gripping the wheel hard. You can't stay on this bridge forever, Morgan said to Flex and Ryder. The real police are going to smell something, and when they get here, there's no getting off this bridge. The real police, Flex snorted. How often do you want to underestimate me, Jack? Insult me. Why dress up as coppers when I can just buy dirty ones? This is a Met police car, and it works this beat. If I say we have all day, we have all day. All fucking day. Morgan shook his head and flicked his eyes to the east. The sun was rising higher in the sky, and with it would come more pedestrians, more scrutiny. They could not stay on this bridge all day. Into the car, Flex ordered Morgan and Herbert. 35 million, Morgan replied. Get in. Flex. Think about the money, Ryder pressed from behind him, but Flex would not. He could only think about reputation and how Morgan had stolen his, and so he reached into the car's back seat and pulled Peter Knight out by his hair. Morgan watched tense as his battered friend was shoved towards the side of the bridge. I'm sick of your shit, Flex spat at Morgan, confirming the American's fears. Either you get in the car or he goes in the river. Morgan could see the handcuffs on Knight's wrists and knew that a fall from this height into the water with hands bound was a death sentence. If he dies, he said evenly, there will be no money, Flex, only death. Get in the car. For a moment all was silent. Then Morgan turned his hate-filled eyes from Flex's face to Knight's. The man he had been so angry with for putting them in this position and for coming between Flex and Morgan's justice. But the true spirit of Morgan's soul broke through, and he knew that no matter what, he could never put his own desires before the safety of his agents and friends. I'll get in the car, he told Flex, stepping forwards, but Knight goes free. Flex smiled, moments from victory. Don't, Ryder called out as Morgan stepped forwards. Stay there. Flex, we're taking the money. Enough, Flex snarled. Everything happened instantly, at once, and at speed. Morgan watched on horrified as Flex used his massive arms to bundle the handcuffed Knight up and over the bridge's side. In the same motion, Flex was already dropping to one knee and pulling his pistol, but Ryder had been faster. No honour amongst thieves, scumbags, or killers, and his first 9mm round chipped stone from just above Flex's head, the second striking Flex in his armoured chestplate. Ryder didn't get the chance to fire another. His eye was drawn to the figure of Morgan, who was pulling his own pistol free, and that split second of indecision cost Ryder his life. Flex fired a double tap from his kneeling position, one round hitting the man in the neck, and the second clipping the side of his head. Ryder went down, but his finger remained depressed on the semi-automatic trigger, 9mm rounds blasting and smashing into the police car's windows and metalwork. Morgan saw, in his peripheral vision, a spray of blood on the windscreen, as the driver took one in the back of his head. 2 deaths had occurred before the large splash below announced that Knight had hit the chopping river, where now, handcuffed, he would have only moments to live. And it looked as though Morgan had those moments. Flex was still twisted away from him, facing Ryder, and now Morgan had a half-second to sight in on the man and fire. It was all he'd need. He would have justice and revenge. His finger touched the trigger. Chapter 102. As Morgan took aim at Flex, Herbert launched himself into Morgan's back and landed on top of him. The pistol fired, but the shot was spoiled, the bullet smashing into one of the ammunition pouches on Flex's hip. "Run, Flex!" Herbert shouted at his leader. The man then bit down onto Morgan's neck like a feral dog. Herbert felt Morgan writhe in agony beneath him, and he used his legs as he had been taught in jiu-jitsu classes, hooking them over and under Morgan's. With his hands still tied behind him and his arm wounded, Herbert wormed and snapped like a lamprey, blood running into his mouth as he sought to save Flex, who he knew would never truly abandon him. They had been through too much together. They were mates. They were comrades with an unspoken bond. Herbert had known Flex's words about killing him for what they were, a ruse to get Herbert back by his side, no man left behind. Herbert had never liked Ryder. He had never understood why Flex employed him in the first place, so he hadn't been surprised to see the man put money before honour and draw on Flex. Now, like a dog trained for blood sport, Herbert was eager to serve his master, his friend. He was eager to serve the man who had told him that he would never abandon him, and that he would be there for him, always. Chapter 103. Time, location, and reality had melted for Flex. He was oblivious to the fact that he was in the centre of a gunfight on London Bridge, pedestrians running, screaming, and cars crashing into one another as they sought to escape the carnage. Flex had been overtaken by the red mist, his anger and rage all consuming. His endgame was a distant memory now. All he wanted to do was kill, kill, kill. Throwing Knight over the bridge had been a good start. He hoped that the weasel suffered a long death. It was a shame he couldn't have given the same end to Ryder, that greedy, shit-headed bastard. But blowing out his throat would have to be enough. Turning through his arc to draw aim against Morgan, Flex briefly noticed the slumped body of his dirty cop behind the steering wheel. What little there had been inside the man's head, now grey jelly against the windscreen. Completing his arc, Flex was surprised to see that Morgan was not up and standing in the aim position, ready to pull his own trigger, but struggling on the ground with someone biting and writhing on top of him as the American howled in agony. "Herbert," Flex realized, "you were actually loyal to the end." Flex pulled the trigger. Chapter 104. Jack Morgan felt the thud of rounds chew into the body on top of him. He heard the screams of pedestrians as they ran, joined by the drivers of vehicles desperate to flee the death on the bridge. Morgan fought his urge to black out from the pain. He had never known anything like it. He had suffered several unpleasant injuries, but never before had a man tried to bite into his arteries like a zombie. The pressure of the bite gave up suddenly as the bullets began to hit like sledgehammer strikes against flesh. Morgan guessed that the man who had assailed him, and who now acted as his unwitting human shield, was Herbert, the idiot loyal to the end and believing Flex cared about anyone but himself. There was little need to guess the identity of the shooter, and Morgan braced himself for the round that would find its way through Herbert's flesh, missing bones and instead coming straight and true to lodge in his own body. It didn't come. The firing stopped. Chapter 105. Flex looked at the pistol in his hand. The top slide was held halfway back by an ejected round that had failed to properly clear the weapon, the empty bullet case now stopping the slide from coming forward to chamber the next round. To clear it would take the experienced Flex only 2 seconds, but as the wails of sirens and cries of armed police sounded behind him, the man realized that it was 2 seconds he didn't have. Flex's mission had been to kill Jack Morgan and those close to him, not to die himself. Looking at the leaking tandem of bodies on the pavement, Morgan silent and unmoving, Flex was content that the first part was done. Now he had to escape. Chapter 106. The time for playing dead was over. Morgan pressed himself up and rolled Herbert's limp body off him. As he looked at the body, he saw that Herbert had been killed by a round in the skull. The bullets that had ploughed into his torso had been stopped by the bulletproof vest Morgan had pulled onto Herbert in Battersea. The man's assurances that he be protected against Flex had ended up saving Morgan's life instead. Without the barrier of Kevlar and flesh on top of him, Morgan would have been bleeding to death on London Bridge. For now he was alive, but time was running out for others. Having lost his pistol in the struggle with Herbert, Morgan now stood empty-handed, his mind struggling to take in the chaos of the scene around him. Ryder lay dead in a pool of his own blood. The dirty police officer was dead and slumped behind the car's wheel. Herbert was no more than a bag of chewed flesh and bone. Flex was gone. And Knight? Morgan ran to the bridge side and peered down. There was no sign of his friend in the swirling grey-brown waters. Morgan swore, then looked left and right along the bridge. He saw panic. The bridge itself was a rout of abandoned vehicles. The centre of the span was empty of civilians, the press of their running bodies cleared to the bridge's ends. There, sirens announced the arrival of the inevitable, London's security services rushing to the point of attack like blood clots to a freshly opened wound. Morgan saw a flash of movement between the cars and vans that stood abandoned on the bridge. He saw Flex, using cover from view and fire as he fled to the south bank, as he fled from justice. On instinct, Morgan turned to follow, but his friendship with Peter Knight stopped him as suddenly as if they'd been attached by a chain. He looked down at the wind-churned waters once more. There was no sign of Private London's leader. Morgan looked to his blood-smeared watch and saw that the time was 5:33, less than 3 minutes since Flex and his crew had arrived in the police car. In those short moments at least 3 men had died. Morgan prayed that it was not 4. Knight could be alive, he knew. He could be alive, and if he was, there was no way Morgan could abandon him. Not when there was hope, no matter how slim. Morgan took one last look at the fleeing shape of Flex, knowing that his chance of bringing vengeance down on Jane Cook's killer may be lost forever. He turned back to the river and prepared to jump. Chapter 107. "Stop!" Morgan heard, coming from a car's loudspeaker as he climbed onto the stone. "Don't jump!" "Don't jump, Jack." It was hearing his name that stopped Morgan, his toes teasing the edge of the ledge as he turned in the direction of the police van that slewed to a halt beside the scene of carnage. Armed officers spilled from its back like pepper from a shaker, their weapons up, ready and searching for targets. Morgan could not be a more inviting one. He felt the press of the revolver in the small of his back and wondered if it was visible. "Don't move!" one of the masked officers shouted at him. But Morgan did move. His eyes moved. They moved to the shape of an unmarked police car that skidded to a crunching halt between the officers and Morgan. The doors flew open. The first man that Morgan recognized was the armed man who had stood guard for Princess Caroline inside the tower. The second was Colonel de Villiers, clad head to foot in tactical gear, a pistol on his hip. "Go!" he shouted at Morgan, waving in the direction of the south bank. "Get Flex." "Knight," Morgan began, looking to the waters. "I've got him," de Villiers promised. "Go, run, get Flex." Morgan took one more look at the empty water beneath him, before turning his predatory eyes to the south. Flex's figure was almost clear of the bridge. Once he hit the mass of streets, Morgan knew the chances of finding him would be almost zero. And so he ran. Chapter 108. Colonel de Villiers watched as the bloodied apparition of Jack Morgan leapt down from the bridge side and raced off towards the southern bank of the Thames. "He's with me!" the colonel shouted to a pair of officers who began to take off in pursuit. The men pulled up short with a look to each other, but knowing well enough that orders were orders. De Villiers ran to the bridge's edge. He knew police boat units were already rushing to the scene, but Knight had been in the water for almost 2 minutes now. His time was running out, if it was not already up. The colonel had watched the man get hurled by Flex into the waters. He had seen Ryder shot, and the struggle that followed. He had seen all this from a drone feed. Morgan had sent word at 5:28 of where the exchange would take place. Jack Morgan, still a Marine and servant to others, had put his own desire for vengeance after what was best for others. He had put his own head in a noose to draw Flex out so that the police could swoop in at the right moment and arrest Jane Cook's killer. De Villiers should have known better than to put faith in a plan to survive contact with the enemy. They had made the difficult decision to stand back and allowed traffic and pedestrians to continue on the bridge. To do anything else would have alerted Flex. What they had not counted on was Flex's temper causing him to throw Knight into the Thames and to begin a shootout that had turned London Bridge into the Wild West. With no other option, Colonel de Villiers shed his gear and jumped from the bridge. Chapter 109. Jack Morgan, drenched in Herbert's blood, launched into his run like a sprinter at some ghastly Olympics. Unlike Flex, he made no effort to weave between the stalled traffic for cover, instead running along the bridge's pedestrianised side. As he ran, he passed some of the city's early risers, who had pressed themselves against the bridge's scant cover, paralysed by fear or too old to run. They looked at him with terror-filled stares, but his eyes were locked on a figure 100 yards ahead, the bulk of Flex conspicuous even from a distance. Flex had a head start, but Morgan had seen Ryder's bullet strike the man in his armoured chestplate. Even the greatest athlete would be winded after such a hit. And Flex was made of 60 pounds more muscle than his heart and lungs had been built to carry. In effect, he was running with a rucksack. In his SAS days, that was exactly what Flex did as his bread and butter, but he was older now, and Morgan could bet that Flex's gym time was spent pumping up his muscles in the mirror rather than on the cardio machines. The result of all this was that Morgan was catching up. The American was at the end of the wide bridge now, and saw Flex fleeing eastwards, with the tail end of the bridge's terrified fugitives. "Out of my way!" Morgan heard the man bellow. "Police! Get out of my way!" The wide-eyed pedestrians moved aside for the human bowling ball, who knocked to the ground any who were too slow to clear a path. As Flex reached a set of elevators that carried passengers down to the ground level of London Bridge Station, a young woman was sent tumbling forwards by the muscle man's barging shoulder. People screamed, and Morgan used those shouts as beacons whenever he lost sight of the man. The foot of the open bridge was now twisting into steps and staircases that entangled into the concrete jungle of buildings, roads, and train track. Morgan had closed the distance, but as the urbanity built up ahead of him, he knew he could lose his quarry from as close as 20 yards away. "Flex!" Morgan called, willing to set himself up as a target, if that's what it took to halt his prey. "Flex!" The second shout reached the man's ears. The fugitive turned, scowled, and snapped off a double tap from his pistol. The bullets zipped by Morgan's head as he continued to run forwards in a crouch, ducking behind a low wall. The sound of panicked civilians was everywhere, but no more shots, and so Morgan risked a look around the end of the wall. There was no sign of Flex. Morgan rushed onwards, preparing for the final showdown. He reached behind his back and pulled free the revolver. He had 6 shots. 6 shots to kill or be killed. Chapter 110. Flex used a backhand to clear a fear-stricken young man from his way, the youth falling backwards with a whimper as Flex barged through the narrow alleyway. "Bastard," he growled to himself. "Bastard." He could not believe Morgan had survived the fusillade of bullets that he had pumped into Herbert's torso. Now the American was clinging to him like the parasite he was, the chances of Flex's escape diminishing with each yard of ground that the man gained. The bastard was harder to kill than a cockroach, he railed. Flex needed him dead. He needed him dead more than he needed almost anything else in the world. The only thing more important than Morgan's death was Flex's own survival. Caught up in moments of red mist and rage, he had lost sight of that. Ryder's greedy treachery had pushed him to the edge and over it, but now Flex was calming and becoming more calculating. Escape and evade, he told himself. "Come on, you old bastard," he goaded. "You were trained for this. Escape, evade, and then track the Yank down and cut his throat. It doesn't have to be today. It doesn't have to be tomorrow. Let him suffer a bit. Let him remember how you blew that bitch's brains out on screen. Let him remember how you chucked his mate into the Thames like he was an empty tracksuit. Let him suffer for a bit and then kill him. Yes, Flex told himself, that's what I'll do. But first he had to escape. To that end he took a wide berth around the train station, knowing there would be coppers there. Instead, he circled it 2 streets over, running eastwards, the roads all but empty of onlookers now. Those that Flex did pass stood still in wide-eyed bewilderment. They saw a running cop, they heard a siren, but they had no idea why. In the big smoke, it could mean a house fire or a terrorist massacre. "What's going on, officer?" an elderly man asked plaintively as Flex thundered past. But Flex had no time to play cops, because he was looking at 2 real ones coming down the street towards him. They pulled their BMW motorbikes to a stop and dismounted. Flex saw his opportunity. "Thank God!" he shouted, cursing inwardly as he saw that the men were armed and cautious. "I got attacked. He's armed and on a rampage, and he's right behind me, covered in blood." "Just stop there, mate," one of the cops called, hand on his pistol. "What's your name and police number?" Flex said nothing. Instead, he cursed his own stupidity. He should never have used the police gambit again after their trap at the London Stadium. Word must have gone out to the police about impostors in uniform, and Flex was not the kind of person people forgot in a hurry, his huge bulk and dishevelled appearance taking these police to the logical assumption that this man might not be what he seemed. "Move your hand away from your weapon," the second cop told him, moving his own hand to his holster. Flex didn't give him the chance, and drew. A double tap cracked the officer in the chest. Flex turned to draw down on his companion, but that officer had already dropped into cover, positioning his bike between himself and the shooter. Flex snarled. He didn't have time for this, so he turned and ran. He ran for the only building he could see with an open entrance. He ran for a building he knew was a dead end, but would at least give him a place where he could take hostages and negotiate. For with a professional's eye, he saw that its top reaches would be almost impossible for his former SAS comrades to assault. And so Flex ran for the Shard. Chapter 111. Jack Morgan heard the gunshots, but did not break stride. They were away to his right, echoing from the street where he had seen Flex disappear. He flinched at the thought of Flex taking more innocent life, and braced himself for what scene he would come across in his pursuit. Morgan prepared for a decision he might have to make between saving that person's life or catching the murdering monster. But then he heard a second set of gunshots crash through the streets, closely overlapped by others, and that overlap could mean only one thing. Flex was in a gunfight. Morgan waited then, a patient hunter behind the low wall of a staircase, steadying himself and waiting for his shot. It came seconds later. Flex barreled out of the street with a quick look over his shoulder, closely followed by a gunshot. Any people in the locale who were not already running and screaming took off like a burst of frightened partridges, obscuring Morgan's view as he brought up his pistol and tracked Flex's progress. He was coming closer, running at an oblique angle to the American, who remained undetected, ready and waiting. Morgan pulled the trigger. The first round went wide, impossible to tell how far, but the sound was enough to draw Flex's attention. The fugitive fired back a trio of shots without breaking stride. One of the bullets struck close, sending chips of brick into Morgan's face and eyes, scratching him and forcing him down into cover. He cursed and wiped his eyes with his fingers to clear his vision. When he looked again, Flex was out of pistol range, charging like a bull ahead, in the direction Morgan knew there would be no escape from, the Shard. With a flash of realization, Morgan understood Flex's intention. He would take captives in one of the country's most difficult buildings in which to effect a hostage rescue, beginning a siege that would end only in the death of innocents or in the government-sanctioned escape of Flex. Morgan could not allow either of those things to happen. He ran onwards. Chapter 112. Flex didn't like running with his back exposed, but with the armed copper in the street, the inevitable backup on its way, and Morgan taking his own shots, He had decided the best thing for him to do was to put his head down and just go. "Get to the Shard," he told himself. "Get in there, grab a hostage, take a breath, work this out." Despite the death and the carnage, Flex was confident he could escape the situation alive. He knew that the government line on not negotiating with terrorists was bollocks. He had seen it with his own eyes, in countless failed states and backwaters around the globe, so he was sure they'd be willing to come to an agreement. After all, Flex had likely trained some of the men who would be orchestrating any planned rescue. He already knew their probable moves. There wasn't much Flex could do to prevent them gaining access to him eventually, but with a few hostages he could make a convincing enough argument that there would only be bodies to greet the would-be heroes. With limited options, Flex charged towards the Shard and the endgame that had been forced upon him. "You!" he shouted to the top-hatted doorman, who was cowering behind a flower pot. "Take me upstairs. Now." If the police uniform was not enough to convince the doorman to comply, the pointed pistol was. "Okay," he stuttered in accented English. "Okay." Flex grabbed the man by the collar of his greatcoat and shoved him towards the golden glimmer of the elevators. "All the way up," he ordered. He backed into the opening doors so that the doorman was between himself and the outside, Flex's gun over the man's shoulder with a clear aim. As the doors began to slide closed, he saw a shape bounding from cover to cover outside. The figure moved too quickly for Flex to be certain it was Jack Morgan, but he fired a double tap anyway. Glass from the building's front cracked and sent frosted spiders' webs outwards. A split second later, the elevator's doors closed. Chapter 113. Morgan picked himself up off his stomach and looked at the cracked glass that had saved his life. The shatterproof windows of the Shard's lower floor had absorbed the impact of Flex's shots. "Stop!" Morgan heard as he broke back into a run. "Get down! Armed police!" Morgan turned to look over his shoulder and saw a running officer 80 yards away. The revolver was clearly visible in Morgan's hands, and one look at the officer's face told the American that he was serious and trying to close the distance before he fired. "Armed police!" he shouted again. Morgan ran. He could not let him close that gap. The Shard lobby was empty as he squeezed between the slowly opening automatic doors, not stopping until he hit the elevator call button. When it didn't open at once, Morgan hit the deck on instinct. He was right to. 2 bullets cracked through the building's open doors, which were now closing once more. The officer rose from the firing position on his knee and began to bound forward. Morgan knew he could never bring himself to shoot the man, but the officer didn't know that. He raised his pistol and fired. The first bullet went a foot wide of his target. The second hit dead center, and the police officer dropped to the ground, then crawled to cover. Morgan had shot out the power box above the glass sliding doors, and now they were immobile, a 6-inch gap between them. It would be enough to buy Morgan moments for his pursuit, before the police response teams could access the building's industrial entrances. It would buy him moments to stop Flex from beginning what could turn out to be one of the country's most bloody hostage situations. It would buy Morgan the time to offer Flex the one thing that could halt his course of action: Morgan's own life. Chapter 114. The doorman whimpered as the elevator shot upwards. The muzzle of Flex's pistol was pressed into his cheek so hard that he could feel it against his teeth. "Please," the man begged, his accent Eastern European. "I have a family." Flex said nothing. His eyes were on the numbers on the elevator's controls. "How many floors in this building?" he demanded. 72. "Then why does this lift only go up to 34? "It goes to the hotel," the terrified man explained. "Then there is another set of lifts." Flex swore. His plan had been to ride the elevator to its highest level, grab a few more hostages, and then to ensconce himself somewhere that had a good view of the entrances, but was clear of windows that would allow him to be taken out by a helicopter-borne sniper. He also didn't put it past the regiment to land on the top of the narrow building before abseiling down and smashing their way through the glass. In fact, they'd probably love that, Flex thought to himself, a sense of pride in his past life reaching up momentarily through his anger and hate. He had been a part of something once, Flex knew. He had been a part of something greater than himself, and not as a cog in a machine, but as a brother amongst pilgrims. Eventually, when push came to shove, he had chosen that band of men over his own wife. She hadn't been able to understand what it was he did, and why he was the way he was. After losing friends in Desert Storm, the last thing Flex needed to hear was her moaning about him having a couple of beers with his mates instead of driving her to Tesco. As much as it had hurt when she'd taken the kids, Flex had seen it as just one more sacrifice to be made in the service of his beloved regiment and his country. And what had happened then? He'd served his years, and though he'd felt fit and able, and had had no wish to leave, the army had had other ideas. Thanks for your work. Sorry about your dead mates. Here's a shit pension. Now piss off, will you, and drink yourself to death somewhere nice and quiet. There's a good man. Not Flex. He had joined the most elite unit in the world to prove a point. That he mattered. That he was good enough. The chip on his shoulder was still there when he left the service, only it had been joined by the vicious things he had done and enjoyed doing in the name of Queen and country. Flex had found he was bloody good at killing people, and as the West had capitalized on the spoils of war, Flex had thought it only right he take his own share. And so he had started PC Gen Security, using his network of Special Forces contacts across the world to bid for the lucrative contracts spawned by the wars on terror and drugs. As he'd snapped them up like a greedy dog, Flex had reached out to men he'd worked with in the world's most dangerous corners. As the money had rolled in, Flex had moved into offices on the Thames, literally, and though he was not in the regiment any longer, he'd had what he wanted. Pride. Respect. A career that kept him in the centre of the world's web of violence and the men who administered it. Jack Morgan had ruined all of that. The beating in the gym had been embarrassing enough, and had left Flex with a ruined knee that had required long and arduous reconstruction. But what had followed from Private was worse than any smackdown. It was the whispers. Flex is a pussy. Flex got his arse beat. Flex is crooked. Flex can't be trusted. Flex knew that Morgan had started those rumours. And soon PC Gen was losing contracts hand over fist. Reputation was everything in this game, and Flex had lost his. What made it most unbearable to such a proud man was that no one had even been hostile about it. They'd simply stopped calling, and like guilty lovers, they'd stopped answering his calls. And there was Morgan, the charismatic American twat who had whispered in the ears of CEOs, politicians, and agents. Morgan was no soldier, Flex fumed to himself. He was a pilot who'd stuck his chopper into the ground and hadn't had the common courtesy to die with it, despite toasting his comrades. He was a schmoozing bastard, not a warrior, and Flex fumed at the thought of the prick's smug face as he stood over him in the gym and demanded answers. "Please, don't hurt me," the doorman in Flex's grip begged, sensing the rising swell of anger. Flex obliged by smashing the man's head into the elevator's polished mirror. The man slumped to the floor, a smear of blood left behind by his ruined skull. Flex looked dispassionately at the body. Another life taken because of Morgan. He was the instigator in all this. He was the one who didn't have the decency to stand, fight, and die. "Bastard!" Flex roared in the confines of the elevator. "Bastard!" he fumed again, as the doors pinged open. Chapter 115. Early morning was a quiet time in the Shangri-La. Customers of the five-star hotel asleep in their comfortable beds or admiring panoramic views from their rooms over coffee. There were only a small number of people in the hotel's reception, an international collection of the establishment's workers, and all were pressed up against the glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows, their fearful eyes zoned in to the pandemonium on London Bridge below, where sirens wailed and lights flashed, dozens of police officers swarming about the bridge like ants on a log. "I can see bodies," A sharp-eyed receptionist gulped. "Is it a terrorist attack?" one of the breakfast chefs asked, logging into Twitter. "I hope not," the duty manager prayed. The sound of the elevator doors pinging open behind them caused the group to turn. They stood frozen as they saw an armed police officer emerging, the body of the hotel's doorman crumpled at his feet. Chapter 116. As Flex emerged from the elevator, he saw the fear on the faces of the people stood huddled in front of him. No, he corrected himself, not people. Sheep. Just waiting for one of their flock to make the first move before the others followed. Flex could see their tiny minds trying to work out what was going on. A man lying slumped dead on the elevator's floor, and a police officer, a symbol that they had been told all of their lives was a force for good, standing over him. Flex decided he would help the sheep make up their minds, and shot the duty manager in the face. Chapter 117. Jack Morgan pressed himself as tightly as he could into the elevator's front left corner. As soon as the doors opened, he expected incoming fire from Flex. Morgan would have a couple of seconds at most before the door was fully open, and he had less than half a foot of cover to hide behind. If Flex was waiting in ambush, Morgan would have a split second to decide if he would gut it out against all odds, or if he would hit the button to close the door and return him to ground level. Deep down, Morgan knew the decision had already been made. For the memory of Jane Cook, there would be no retreat. He watched as the elevator's numbers crept upwards, hitting 34 in a smooth stop. He pulled the pistol up to his shoulder, ready to punch out and aim immediately as the doors opened. They did so with a pleasant ping, and Morgan prepared himself for a fusillade of gunshots. None came. All was quiet, but for the sobs of a chambermaid who leaned back against a high glass window. She was cradling someone in her arms. Morgan only needed one look at the limp body to see that the person was dead. "Is he in here?" Morgan shouted, maintaining his position. "Is he in here?" The woman shook her head and sobbed. Morgan stepped out, his eyes drawn to the body of a suited man who lay dead on the floor. Suddenly, Morgan's ear was drawn to the sounds of relaxing, melodic music that continued to play in the reception area despite the carnage that was playing out beneath the hidden speakers. He swept his pistol left and right, but all was clear. "Where is he? Where did he go?" The chambermaid was incapable of speech, but she pointed in the direction of a second set of elevators. "Does he have hostages?" Morgan asked, reaching into the woman's pockets and coming up with her access card. She nodded, sending tears dropping down onto the face of the young man in her arms. Morgan had no time to comfort her. He left and ran in the direction of the elevators. "Please, don't hurt me," a man shouted. Morgan turned to see a businessman, huddled, shaking beneath a table. "Please." "Did you see who went in here?" Morgan asked sternly. The man nodded. "How many people with him?" "3, I think. Maybe 4. Please don't hurt me." "I'm not going to hurt you. There's a woman over there." Morgan pointed back towards the sobbing chambermaid at the window. "Grab her and get downstairs. Go." After swallowing the lump of fear in his throat, the man scuttled away, and Morgan turned his attention to the elevator. It had only one destination, the highest floor. He looked once more at the fleeing man, who had stopped at the sobbing woman and was now moving her towards the elevator that would take them down to safety. Morgan sucked in a deep breath to calm the nerves and adrenaline that pumped through his system. Then he cast a cool glance out at the magnificent vista of London. Morgan had seen worse places to die. With that thought in his mind, he stepped into the elevator that would deliver him either to revenge or to his death. Chapter 118. "Get over there," Flex ordered his 6 captives, brandishing his pistol. 4 of them he had herded like the sheep they were from the 34th floor. Another 2, both cleaners, had been acquired as they'd arrived in the building's viewing rooms and the highest reaches of the Shard. The viewing rooms were confined, Flex realized, and unsuited to his purposes. He couldn't keep point of aim over all entry points, and he certainly couldn't cover all angles in the room by himself, the layout stretching around the elevator at its centre. He realized there was only one true option for him. He dragged her hostage by the hair, moving the short distance to the window, so that he could see the towers and buildings below, some reaching as high as the Shard's waist. "Look at the flags," Flex told the younger woman. "What are they doing?" "The flags," she mumbled, confused. Flex slapped her hard to sharpen her senses. "I'll look for you," a young man offered bravely. Flex didn't need people deciding they were heroes. That could be trouble down the line, and so the young man's offer earned him a bullet in the chest. "What are the flags doing?" he demanded again against the screams. "Blowing. They're blowing," the woman bawled. That was what Flex had seen, but his eyesight wasn't what it had been, and he didn't want to wager his life without a second opinion. Knowing that the winds were high, he made a calculated gamble. Chances of the commanders signing off on their snipers taking a shot in high wind speed with hostages, low. Chances of them storming the floor from a direction that Flex wasn't facing and killing him before he could react, high. "We're going up on the roof," Flex ordered. He was just about to give a second command when the single elevator pinged and its doors began to open. On instinct, Flex raised his pistol and fired. Chapter 119. Jack Morgan didn't see Flex open fire, but he heard him well enough. The pistol's reports crashing around the small space of the elevator as the bullets went zipping towards Morgan, who survived every shot. Knowing that Flex would likely cut him down as soon as the doors opened, Morgan had stacked the elevator with tables behind which he could take cover. The five-star hotel had bought the best timber, and now Flex's 9mm bullets flattened and died against it, protecting Morgan from the storm of steel that Flex unleashed his way. When he heard the click of an empty magazine, Morgan sprang up and punched out the revolver, ready to fire. He saw Flex, red-faced and angry, the man he longed to kill, but he saw too the young woman that Flex's left hand had gripped by the hair, pulling her close to him and using her as a shield. Eyes went wide. Both men knew that, without using both hands, Flex would not be able to execute a quick enough reload to kill Morgan before Morgan killed him. Both men also knew that until Flex let go of the girl, Morgan would not fire. It was a standoff. Flex began to back away. Morgan tracked him with the pistol, but he knew he could not fire and risk hitting the weeping girl. The revolver's short barrel was not made for accuracy, and so Morgan would have to kill Flex up close. "He's out of ammo," Morgan told the girl. "Be calm." "Don't try and run," Flex whispered venomously into her ear. "I can drop this pistol and draw my knife long before you get free. I'll cut your throat like it was butter." "Why don't you use that knife on me instead of a defenseless woman?" Morgan tried, as Flex stepped back towards the maintenance doorway that would lead them to the final flight of stairs and the building's 1,000-foot peak. "You know what I regret? That I didn't rape that bitch of yours. That I didn't smash her before blowing her brains out." Morgan needed every piece of his concentration to force down the black rage that built inside of his chest and threatened to consume him. "I should have let the other lads have turns too," Flex goaded, backing through the doorway. "Don't follow me." "Fuck you, Flex. I'm the one with the loaded gun here." "What was your favorite part of her?" Flex asked, as Morgan followed him into the bare utility of the maintenance stairwell. "The tits? Her face? I didn't see much of them, but I did see her brains, Jack. There was a lot of them. Made a hell of a mess on the floor, they did." Morgan willed his mind to shut out the words, but the cloud of rage was rising, trying to push him into recklessness. "Your hands are shaking," Flex laughed, seeing the slightest of trembles in Morgan's aim. "You should be thanking me. You'd have got tired of her and chinned her off soon enough anyway. At least this way no one else gets inside her. Well, Unless the guys at the morgue are a little— "You shut your goddamn mouth," Morgan hissed, the veneer of his cool cracking and revealing lava beneath. "Or what, Jack? You gonna get this girl killed too, just like you did Jane?" Flex was at the top of the staircase. "Open the door," he told the girl, who squirmed awkwardly to obey. Flex kept her body between himself and Morgan. The girl's own frame wasn't enough to cover the entirety of his muscular bulk, but it was enough for Morgan. "Let's just do this. You and me," Morgan tried again. Flex spat at him instead. Then he backed out onto the top of Britain's tallest building. Chapter 120. 1,000 feet above the country's sprawling capital, the wind slapped Morgan hard in the face as he followed Flex onto the highest level of the Shard. Nothing between them and the elements but guardrails. Morgan kept the revolver trained at Flex's head, but he knew there was no way he could pull the trigger. The shot had been a difficult one before. Now, with the wind, it was a near certainty the girl would die first. "Let her go, and I'll put my gun down," Morgan said, his voice raised against the wind. Flex backed himself into an area of the roof where the glass panels that gave the building its name would cover his back from heli-borne snipers. "You're out of options, Flex. London is covered in cameras. Your crimes are on tape. You can go to prison or you can die." Flex snorted, and Morgan knew he was holding out for a third option, to keep the girl as a hostage and bargain his way out. Morgan hadn't considered that there could be a fourth. Suddenly, with no warning, Flex shoved the girl forwards at Morgan, the massive muscles of his chest and arm propelling her like a rag doll. The girl's arms flailed, and her hair was blown in the wind as she stumbled and tripped the few meters towards the American. Morgan knew instantly what Flex's ploy was: to buy himself 2 seconds to reload his empty pistol and finish Morgan, so he made to sidestep and fire whilst Flex was reaching for his spare magazine. But the girl came at him like a lost child to her parents, her eyes wild with terror, unable to see that by grabbing at Morgan she was sealing both of their fates. "Off!" Morgan screamed at her, pushing the clutching girl away and expecting 9mm rounds to begin punching into the bodies of both of them. "Off!" he yelled, again, grabbing a scruff of her jacket and sending her spinning towards the door. But her flailing arms knocked the pistol from his hand and sent it skidding across the metal floor. Now, unarmed, he knew that he would die. He looked to Flex. The murderer pushed the fresh magazine onto his pistol and was raising it up to face Morgan's body. As it came, the thumb of Flex's left hand moved to push down on the release catch, which would allow the top slide to come crashing forwards and chamber the round that would kill Jack Morgan. Morgan knew there was no escape now, so he steeled himself to look Flex in the eye, desperate to avoid showing a single ounce of fear that the man could enjoy. Flex's thumb hit the weapon's release catch. Prepared for death, Morgan watched as the top slide came forward and jammed halfway. Chapter 121. Flex looked down at the weapon in his hand, seeing the top slide stuck halfway forwards, the weapon rendered useless. "No!" he shouted. The reason for the malfunction was instantly clear. Morgan's gunshot on the bridge. It had hit the ammunition pouch and caused enough of a bend in the magazine to pinch the top, which now stopped the spring from feeding up the bullet as the carrier came forwards to collect and chamber the round. Even if he were to clear the obstruction, the same malfunction would occur over and over again. Without another magazine, which Flex did not have, the semi-automatic pistol was useless. Looking across at the man he longed to kill, Flex realized that Jack Morgan had come to the same conclusion. His eyes went to the floor, and Morgan's dropped revolver. Chapter 122. Jack Morgan had been ready to receive death. Now, seeing that Flex's weapon had been rendered useless, relief flooded into him like sunlight. Still, he knew his reprieve would be short unless he could put Flex down, so he lunged towards the revolver that the girl, now a memory rushing away into the stairwell, had knocked flying from his hands. At least, that's what Morgan convinced Flex he was doing. The big man took the bait and went diving for the weapon like a linebacker onto a quarterback. Morgan had pulled himself up short and stayed on his feet, and now he delivered a crushing kick into the side of Flex's thick skull. Flex roared in agony, but still he reached for the pistol. Morgan stamped quickly on his fingers, feeling something crack and give way. He was about to deliver another kick when Flex forgot about the pistol and instead rolled towards Morgan's leg like a hungry gator. Enough of his fingers unbroken to grab a boot in a vice-like grip, and his free hand moving to a knife on his belt. Morgan threw himself forwards. Flex lost his grip as Morgan bounced off his broad back, his hands going for the knife that was now free in Flex's left hand. Like a drunken rodeo rider, Morgan hooked his legs around Flex's own, attempting to keep the man's bucking body pressed down to the floor as he wrestled the blade from Flex's meaty hand. "I'll kill you," Flex screamed. "I'll kill you." Morgan had no doubt of it, so he resorted to the most basic of human instincts when life is in danger. A tactic taught to him by Flex's own comrade. He bit, his teeth pressing down into the flesh of Flex's knife hand. The pinned man roared, and Morgan felt the knife twitch. A moment later, Morgan's vision began to blur from blood running into his eyes. Lots of blood. He sank his teeth in deeper. Flex howled and bucked, finally shaking Morgan loose. The American rolled clear, with blood in his mouth and eyes, and a knife in his hand. Flex charged forwards, taking Morgan in a bull rush. Morgan drove the knife forward at him, but the police stab vest absorbed the blow, and the blade buckled from Morgan's hand. He was slammed backwards by Flex's mad charge, and the lower guardrail hit across his kidneys, all air being driven from him. Flex threw a headbutt into Morgan's face, opening a deep cut above his eye and adding to the blood already covering his face. Morgan tried to look at the man, but all he could see was a red haze through the blood in his eyes. As he saw the bulk of Flex's upper body pull back for another headbutt, Morgan realized this was the final chance for him to bring justice to Jane's killer. As Flex made to drive his head into Morgan's face, Morgan gripped hold of his enemy, pushed up from his legs, and used the momentum of the muscle man's headbutt to bend himself backwards over the guardrail and to the 1,000-foot drop below. Chapter 123. As Jack Morgan's body hit the narrow ledge 10 feet below the Shard's upper deck, he was almost grateful that blood clouded his sight and saved him from seeing clearly the terrible truth that he was 300 metres above London, with nothing between himself and the earth but the metre-wide shelf that he and Flex had crashed onto. Only a snagging of Flex's equipment belt had stopped them from bouncing from the ledge and into oblivion, and now Morgan was quickest to get to his feet as the big man sought to free himself of the entanglement. Morgan scrambled free of Flex's hold, and now he used the bottom of his shirt to clear the blood from his eyes. As the red liquid was wiped away, Morgan's heart raced into his mouth. London was laid out below him like a three-dimensional Monopoly board. As a gust of wind shook the tower's top, Morgan wasn't sure if he'd ever been more scared in his life. But he was alive. He was alive and in the sky, and that was a place where Morgan knew comfort as well as fear. The same could not be said of Flex, who now gripped for fingerholds with terror in his eyes. "Long way down," Morgan taunted, enjoying the man's panic. "Help me up," Flex begged, all grudges forgotten, as he found himself inches from death. Morgan smiled darkly, then jumped upwards, his hands grabbing a hold of the metal fixtures that the tower's audacious work crew would use to clip in their belts as they descended to clean and maintain the glass Leviathan. Morgan shut out any thought of the terrible possibility of what a mistimed jump or poor hand grip could mean. Instead, he focused all his strength and courage on leaping from handhold to handhold, moving his feet closer to the tower's summit and safety in strides. Morgan pushed Flex from his mind, concentrating solely on his movement, trying to predict the wind and to jump between its vicious gusts. It was on his final leap, barely 2 feet from the top, that his luck ran out, and a savage thrust of air hit Morgan as he was free of his handholds. The gust blew him to his left, and his right hand snatched at the fixture that had been meant for his left. He caught it, but the movement spun his body, and he found himself facing outwards, his back to the building, and nothing ahead of him but sky. Below him on the ledge, Flex saw his moment for victory, and grabbed at Morgan's legs like a cat after a bird. Morgan was saved by Flex's inability to let go of his own handhold, and so only one hand reached up to grasp at him. Morgan tucked his legs up to avoid Flex's grabs, but the movement left him even more vulnerable to the wind, his outstretched knees catching every gust. As Morgan moved his left hand to join his right and double his grip, he looked up and realized there was only one choice left to him, a movement that would either save his life or take it. Without waiting a second more before the next gust could hit, he drew his knees up towards his chin and, like a gymnast, curled his body upwards so that his feet went above his head, pushing through the movement until he felt his shins scrape against the metal of the floor above. Pushing with his hands, Morgan shoved his body up and back and slid himself onto the upper deck. His chest heaving from exertion and the endorphins of near death, he looked down at Flex, helpless on the ledge below. Then he turned his eyes to the revolver that lay beside him. Chapter 124. Michael Flex Gibbon looked up at the revolver that was pointing down at his face. "Put one in my head," he asked Morgan, knowing the game was over. "I don't want to fall, Jack. For God's sake, put one in my head." Morgan said nothing. He wasn't seeing Flex, and not because the blood was trickling into his eyes and blocking his vision. It was the picture of Jane Cook, seconds from death, that he could see in front of him. Then it was the image of her violent execution, carried out by the man who now waited helpless below Morgan, begging for mercy. "Put one in my head," Flex pleaded. Morgan did not. Instead, he used the pistol to trace out the other parts of Flex's body below him. "No," Flex shouted, knowing that any wound that didn't kill him would certainly brush him from his narrow perch. "Please." Morgan's pistol hand shook with rage, adrenaline, and grief. It shook as another gust of wind hit the building's top. Flex dug his fingernails into the building's side, as if he thought he could claw his way to safety. "For God's sake, Jack," he cried, "shoot me before I get blown off here. Shoot me! Shoot me!" Morgan felt the cold metal of the trigger beneath his finger. He had the bullets, and he had the shot. Since Jane's murder, he had dreamed of this moment, the fate of the killer in his hands, his face filling the sights of Morgan's pistol. "Do it for Jane," Jack Morgan thought savagely to himself. "Do it for Sharon Lewis. Do it for Peter Knight. Do it for all those other people that Flex has left dead, ruined or scarred in his wake. Do it," Morgan told himself. "Do it," his mind screamed. And so he did. Chapter 125. "Climb," Morgan ordered. "Now." "You won't kill me?" Flex asked in disbelief. "I won't kill you," Morgan spat. "Now climb," he shouted again, his pistol unwavering as the big man's shaking fingers searched for their first handholds. Flex winced with pain as he put strain on the hand that Morgan had crunched beneath his boot. Grimacing, he began to haul himself upwards. To stay on the shelf was to risk the wrath of the wind, but Flex was no more secure from it as he began his slow ascent, his big body buffeted by the gusts. "Get me a rope or something," he shouted up. Morgan said nothing and stared impassively. Knowing that no help was coming, and seeing that he was alone in his efforts, Flex gritted his teeth and pushed higher. Morgan watched with grim satisfaction as he saw the pain that Flex's right hand was causing him. "You're getting tired, Flex," Morgan taunted. "All that muscle and one heart. Your blood's not getting around fast enough, Flex. Your muscles are filling with lactic acid, and soon you'll cramp. One big gust, Flex, and you're done." "You said you wouldn't kill me," Flex shouted up. "And I won't," Morgan replied, his face devoid of emotion. And that was the truth. Jack Morgan had decided to let Flex climb and face justice. During the murderer's ascent, the winds had calmed, and Morgan wondered if perhaps some force unknown to him wanted to see the man answer for his crimes in court. He looked down at the struggling man below him. Flex's red face was a mere 2 feet from the ledge now, close enough for Morgan to put a hole through his skull without thinking, but his finger remained away from the trigger because he knew without hesitation what Jane Cook and Peter Knight would tell him. They would want justice, but they would want it within the law of the country they loved so much. "Help me, please," Flex pleaded, and one look told Morgan that the man's oversized muscles had run out of gas a mere foot from his refuge. "Come on, Jack. Please. I can't keep holding on." Morgan looked into Flex's eyes and saw the big man's spirit wither as he realized that the American's mercy had extended to its furthest point. "I don't want to die, Jack. Please. I have kids." Peter Knight had kids, Morgan said evenly, taking a step backwards to drive home Flex's predicament. The former soldier grimaced and looked to his right hand. With 2 broken fingers, he could barely hold on. "I'll confess everything," Flex shouted. "I'll confess. Just, please, don't let me die." "You'll confess?" "Yes. Just get me up there." Morgan thought for a few seconds, during which Flex dug his fingernails into his hands as he sought to tighten his grip. Then Morgan pulled out his phone and opened the camera. "Confess," he ordered. And Flex did. He told about how he had attacked Morgan and his team at the Brecon Hotel and in the forest. He told of how he had murdered Jane Cook and beaten PC Sharon Lewis to within an inch of her life. He told of how he had feigned an attack on Hooligan to lure Morgan into a deadly trap. When that hadn't worked, he had kidnapped Peter Knight and then thrown him into the Thames. From there, Flex told of how he had shot down innocent civilians in his bid to escape. "How's your conscience?" Morgan asked the man. "Just get me up," Flex growled. Morgan turned off the camera, then shook his head. "We had a deal," Flex begged. Morgan braced himself as a gust of wind shook the buildings, and Flex's fingers began to slip. "Don't do this, Jack. You can't let me die." Morgan knelt and looked into Flex's dark soul. "You're a good man, Jack," Flex pleaded. "And she was a better woman." Morgan held Flex's terrified stare until the next blast of wind rocked the tower top and Flex's fingers slipped away. Chapter 126. As he watched Flex fall away into oblivion, the weight of Jack Morgan's grief came crashing down. Her killer had received justice, but Jane Cook was still dead. Nothing would ever bring her back. He sank to his knees and closed his eyes. That's how he was found by the armed men that burst onto the building's rooftop. Without an ounce of resistance, Morgan let himself be pushed face first into the cold metal flooring. He heard the men shouting, but he paid them no heed. Hands cuffed behind his back, Morgan was dragged to his feet, roughly, and a hood was pulled over his head. Shoved and pulled by his captors, Morgan was taken from the roof and inside the building. There he was lifted and put onto a gurney, where he felt a second cuff attached to his right ankle. Morgan's world turned darker still as what felt like a blanket was laid over him. Jack Morgan said nothing through all this. He felt the sensation of falling through air, and presumed it was the elevator. He heard distant sounds of sobbing, sirens, and shouts of command. He felt himself pushed and wheeled, the sudden bump of the gurney's legs tucking as he was slid into what he presumed was an ambulance. Seconds later the siren blared, and he felt the unmistakable movement of a vehicle travelling at speed. He had no idea how long it was until the vehicle stopped. His gurney was unloaded, and Morgan was wheeled through quiet corridors. He had no idea how long it was until a man pulled away the blanket, and then the hood. Peter Knight? Morgan asked, looking up at the man above him, desperate to know the fate of his friend. Is he alive? Knight is at Guy's Hospital, Colonel de Villiers told him. But he's alive. Morgan closed his eyes in relief. The colonel pretended not to notice the tear that ran down Morgan's cheek. Instead, he used a set of keys to take off the cuffs that bound Morgan to the gurney. The American pushed himself up and took in his surroundings. He was in a bare corridor, the smell of bleach and disinfectant thick in his nostrils. "I'm sorry you had to be brought in like this," de Villiers said, as Morgan rubbed at his sore wrists. "Given the circumstances, we decided the best option was to convince MI5 to claim you as an operative. As far as everyone but the few operators from the rooftop knows, you were a British intelligence asset who died heroically. Jack Morgan has been under my protection in the tower this entire time." "You said we," Morgan asked. "The Princess likes you," de Villiers replied, confirming Morgan's thoughts about who had been pulling the strings to keep him out of a British prison. "Thank you, Colonel," Morgan said, putting out a hand. "Marcus," the guards officer insisted. "You saved Peter's life?" Morgan asked as they shook. De Villiers smiled. "He saved his own. I found him on one of the stone arches. He'd kicked his way there and was using his cuffed hands to grip a submerged mooring ring. His head was just above water." "So you did save him," Morgan smiled. "I helped him." For keeping him from prison, Morgan had offered the colonel a handshake. For saving Peter Knight's life, he put his arm around the taller man and embraced him. "No need to make a scene, Morgan," de Villiers said, colouring a little. "Jack," Morgan told him, standing back. "Thank you, Marcus." De Villiers smiled and straightened his jacket. "But now, if I'm not here to see Peter," Morgan asked, "then where am I?" De Villiers cleared his throat and told him. Chapter 127. The smell of bleach and disinfectant hit Jack Morgan strongly as he pushed open a heavy door and entered the pathologist's lab. The room as still and lifeless as the woman that lay at its centre. Jane Cook. He stopped, as if shot, when he saw the shape of the covered body on the metal table. The memory of his lover's contours etched into his mind so that even the silhouette of her was enough to trick him into believing it had all been a nightmare, and that Jane would now rise, smiling, and kiss him. She never would, Morgan knew. Jane Cook would never breathe again. She would never laugh again. She would never crease the corner of her lip when she was deep in thought. A memory that now pushed a choked laugh of love from Morgan's dry throat. He approached her. De Villiers had warned Morgan not to pull the sheet away, and Morgan obeyed. He had seen her death. He knew what lay beneath the sheet. No matter how he wished he didn't. Instead, he reached under the material and felt out Jane's hand. As he gripped her cold fingers, a quartet of tears trickled over the cuts and bruises of his cheeks. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I know that Flex's death can never bring you back, but you were a warrior. I wanted you to know that justice was done." Morgan used his free hand to wipe at his red eyes. They were tired, so tired. Behind him, he heard the sound of the doors opening. "Give me 5 more minutes, Colonel." "It's me, Jack," came the voice of Princess Caroline in response. Morgan turned. The royal was dressed in dark jeans and a hoodie, and held a baseball cap in her hands. "I came to pay my respects. To her, and to you." Morgan let go of Jane's cold hand and delicately placed the sheet back over her still flesh. "You got what you wanted, Jack?" Morgan shook his head. "I can never get back what I want." The royal looked to the shrouded body. "The city's going crazy," she told him after a moment. "Another lone wolf attack. A troubled individual hitting out at society they feel has failed them." Morgan raised an eyebrow. That's how you're writing this off? She nodded. Flex is a dark stain on the British Armed Forces and the country, and he's one that's best forgotten as quickly as possible. The story that we tell can make all the difference. And how will that happen? Morgan asked, sceptically, thinking of the carnage left in Flex's wake, the lives taken or blighted forever. People see what they want to see, and believe what they want to believe, Princess Caroline explained. A tragedy where a broken veteran went on a rampage before throwing himself to his death. The media will lap it up like milk. Why not the truth? Caroline shrugged. Because there's nothing to gain from it. The SAS tarnished, the police tarnished. Yourself tarnished? Morgan added. She met Morgan's eyes and nodded. You found Sophie's killer, Jack, and now you've avenged yourself on the man who killed the woman who was special to you. I think it would be best if you stayed away from the UK for a while. Flex may have more friends. They know where to find me, Morgan replied, causing Caroline to smile whimsically. How have you lived so long, Jack? Morgan smiled in return. Thank you for coming to see me, Your Highness. I'll take your advice and change the scenery. But first, I have things to do. Colonel de Villiers will see you're taken care of, the Princess promised. Don't let him resign over this, Morgan told her. Caroline gave an apologetic smile. I'm afraid that was a lie, and my idea. We thought that you'd be more likely to believe his help was genuine if you saw him falling on his sword. Morgan shrugged it off. Then he turned to take one last look at the woman who had taken his heart. I'll leave you to pay your respects to Jane, he said to the Princess. She was a hell of a woman, and a soldier. I know, Caroline confirmed. I'll be sure that she's remembered as such. Goodbye, Jack. Goodbye, Caroline. With those words, Morgan walked from the room, knowing that though the body of Jane Cook would be left behind him, her memory would be carried forever in his heart. Epilogue. Jack Morgan had been standing for a long time in the hospital's corridor. He had been driven there by Marquis de Villiers, the men saying their farewells with some sadness, a mutual respect and admiration having grown between them. During the drive across London, de Villiers had informed Morgan that the media was indeed lapping up the story circulated that Flex had been a troubled veteran who had gone on a rampage before taking his own life. It's all very neat, Morgan had remarked. You don't leave much mess, de Villiers had replied. Jack Morgan knew that wasn't true. Jane Cook was dead, as were a handful of innocent bystanders. So too were Flex and his crew. Morgan had not an ounce of pity for the dead killers, but even so, he wished he could have taken them down more cleanly, without so much blood being spilled. He exhaled loudly. And then there were Sharon Lewis and Peter Knight. They rested in the hospital towards the end of the corridor in which he was now standing. But Morgan could not bring himself to walk the short distance and to face the two people who had almost died in a vendetta that had been targeted at Jack Morgan himself. "You're going to stand there all day?" Morgan heard from over his shoulder. He turned quickly and looked down. A man in a wheelchair had spoken the words, two young kids combining forces to push him. "Luke, Isabel," Peter Knight said to his children, "go and see Sharon." "Okay, Daddy." They smiled and raced each other to the end of the corridor. "I thought you died," Morgan said as the children disappeared from sight. "I didn't," Knight smiled. He gestured, sensing Morgan's reluctance to talk in public. "I thought you were gone, Peter," Morgan told his friend, after pushing him to privacy. "Thank God." "Thank my parents," Knight grinned. "Swimming lessons." Morgan shook his head and looked at his hands. "I shouldn't have left you. De Villiers came in for me. That lanky bugger's a strong swimmer. He helped me into the police boat. Still, you had to get Flex," Knight insisted. You had to, Jack, for all of us. We all loved her. She was one of us. She was, Morgan acknowledged with love and pride. I know she meant more to you than maybe anyone, Jack, but she was a friend and a sister to everyone in Private London. I still can't believe it. Morgan put a hand on his friend's shoulder. Knight turned his head upwards. The look that passed between the men was enough to say all that words could, and more. That they shared love and grief, purpose and brotherhood. Eventually Knight spoke. I've got to leave, Private Jack. The kids. I can't. Morgan said nothing. He understood. A nod and a look told Knight as much. Let's go back to the room, Morgan suggested, forcing a smile. I want to hang out with these kids that are stealing my best agent. The sound of animated chatter grew louder as Morgan wheeled Knight along the corridor. I'm okay to walk, Knight insisted. I'm sure you are. But there's a lot of pretty nurses here, Peter. Make the most of it while you can. Knight snorted and used his foot to push open the door. The source of the raucous babble was revealed immediately. Hooligan, playing the fool for Knight's laughing children. All right, boss, he grinned, spotting the American. Hooligan? Morgan smiled before turning his head to a bed in the room's corner. Lewis? You got him, Jack. Her eyes sparkled with pride. I did. The next few hours passed with laughter, some golden, some solemn. They made remembrance of their friend, and they looked to the future. Through it all, the grief of Jane Cook's departure banged on Morgan's soul like the battering ram of a besieging enemy. But he held the pain at bay, with the love and company of his agents, with Lewis, and with the children of his dear friend. It could never last forever, Morgan knew, and he was right. Hooligan's phone began to ring. It's for you, boss, he explained, passing it over. Jack Morgan. Faces peered intently as Morgan received what could only be the briefing of a task newly dropped onto Private's desk. As the one-sided conversation drew on, Knight observed how Morgan's battered body began to fill with purpose. By the time he hung up the call, Morgan's back was straight, his eyes alive. I've got to go, he told the room. Is it a good one? The newly retired Peter Knight asked. It is, Morgan told him, getting to his feet. Knight looked from his playing children to the adults in the room. One group were his family, and the other group were his— Can I withdraw my— Knight began. Morgan cut him off with a smile. You are Private London, Peter. We are, Knight insisted, taking in his friends. We are. They embraced. Then, with pride in his step and purpose in his soul, Jack Morgan walked from the room. He was on to his next mission.
This has been a Hachette audio production of Princess, written by James Patterson and Rhys Jones. Read by Colin Mace. Princess is also available in print and digital formats from Grand Central Publishing, a division of Hachette Book Group. For more Hachette audio productions, visit us at hachetteaudio.com. Thank you for listening. Text copyright 2018 by James Patterson. Audio production copyright 2018 by Random House Audiobooks. All rights reserved. Hachette Book Group supports the right to free expression and the value of copyright. The purpose of copyright is to encourage writers and artists to produce the creative works that enrich our culture. The duplicating, uploading, and distribution of this audiobook without permission is a theft of the author's intellectual property. If you would like permission to use material from the audiobook, other than for review purposes, please contact permissions@hbgusa.com. Thank you for your support of the author's rights. This audiobook is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously, and any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events or locales, is entirely coincidental.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.